This is the first in a series of videos on making and applying double fold binding to the edges of our quilts, including those beautiful mitered corners. In this video, we're going to talk about how to make a binding strip from individual strips of fabric that have been cut either with a grain or on the bias. I hope you enjoy. Double fold binding is just individual strips of fabric that we've sewn together to make one long binding strip and then pressed it in half. So we have two layers of fabric that we're going to attach around the outside edge of our quilt. Usually our strips are 2 1/4 or 2 1/2 inches wide. It's a personal preference. I make mine 2 1/4 because that works best for me. You may have to pull some fabric that you're not as fond of from your stash and try it out, see what works best for you. Our binding strips can be cut either along the grain or on the bias. If we cut along the grain, then we're going to have long threads that run the length of our strip. So if we grow a hole, it's going to want to spread. If we cut on the bias, then we have lots of short threads all down the length of our strip. So if one of them grows a hole, it's not as likely to spread. Bias bindings are great for heirlooms or things that are going to receive really, really heavy use because it's a very, very durable binding. Our first question is, how much binding do I need? All you need to do is measure the perimeter of your quilt. So measure each of your sides, add those together, and then add about 10 inches or maybe a little more to connect the ends of your two binding pieces together. There are lots of resources, both on the internet and in print, to help you figure out how many strips you're going to need and how much fabric you're going to need. My personal favorite, the all-in-one Quilter's Reference Tool. This has so much information in it that I use all the time. Everything from how many blocks do I need to make a certain size quilt, to special instructions for unusual kinds of seams, to how many strips do I need to make a certain length of binding, and how much fabric do I need to make that many strips. Or if I'm using the continuous bias binding, how big of a square do I need to start with to make that much binding. It also has things like instructions for completing the ends of those bindings, different methods for doing mitered corners. There's just so much in here that I don't want to have to look up again and again, so I just have it all in one easy reference. To make binding that's cut with the grain, we can cut however many strips we need, either crosswise of the grain or lengthwise of the grain, and then we'll just sew those individual strips together to make one long binding strip. To make bias binding, we can either Set our ruler along the 45-degree line of our fabric and cut individual bias strips, stitch them together, or we can make continuous bias binding, which starts out with a square of fabric that you cut and sew before you then cut that into your one long strip of binding. And I have a separate video showing you how to do that. I've cut my individual binding strips and I'm ready to join them together. I like to join my strips on an angle because once I've applied it to my quilt, that seam will almost disappear. So I'm going to place my first strip face up vertical. I'm going to place my second strip face down horizontal. I'm going to pin those together because my hands move things. Then I'm going to draw a line from the top left to the bottom right point where those strips are crossing, and I'm ready to stitch. Once I've sewn my strips together, I'm just going to trim. So I have a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Snip off those little tails. I'm going to open it out and press my seam allowance open, and I'll have a nice smooth join between two different strips. I press that open, then I will just fold my binding in half and press. When I press my binding strip in half, I want to make sure that the strip itself is supported so the weight of the strip isn't going to stretch or distort my binding. I like just a little spray of water and then fold it in half. And press. You want to be sure that you press instead of iron because you don't want to stretch or distort your strip. And I'll just keep working my way. Down the length of my strip, just like this. So when we've done our entire strip, we're ready to apply it to the edges of our quilt.